Salamat pagi. Good morning. Vice Chancellor Professor Dr. Faisal Rafiq Muhammad Adigan. Dean Dr. Nurzali Ismail. Deputy Dean Dr. Juliana Abdul Rahab. Other distinguished speakers and participants, ladies and gentlemen. Never in my wildest dreams 50 years ago could I have envisioned that what we started as a program would develop into this. At the time, we were 2 faculty members teaching about 8 courses, very broadly defined. We had 2 batches of students of about 25 each. It was out of my imagination at that time that University Science Malaysia School of Communications would be offering a Bachelor of Arts, 4 masters, a PhD degree, that it would employ 28 or more faculty members, and also make available a curriculum of 52 undergraduate courses. To build all of that over the past 5 decades required much dedication, tenacity, and hard work by many people. We thank all of them today for their commitment to the University Science Malaysia School of Communications. It is 1972. I'm about to meet my first batch of University Science Malaysia Communications students. I'm contemplating what I would discuss with them. I certainly will have to tell them about the reportage of events of that disruptive period, the Vietnam War, the civil rights movements, the revitalization of the feminist movements, the continuing and emerging authoritarianism in Asia, and the early aspects of Watergate in the United States. My new students, among them, Manso Amat, Hamima Dona Mustafa, Paul Guano, and Paramala Devi, must be told how mass media are structured, their missions, their biases, and other issues. They must learn about the then current trends and problems of what was then termed the Third World, and also their mass communications. After all, Malaysia is part of the Southern Hemisphere, and worldwide attention in 1972 is focused on this region's communication systems and how they can be how they're being controlled and how they can be used for social change purposes and other social consciousness reasons. It is the development journalism, development communication age. In the next 3 semesters, I will share with Lena Carr, Paramaswamy, Matthew George, and Bachan Cargill the highly visible and rapidly spreading authoritarianism that threatens the southern half of the world. In Asia, it came in different forms and guises: martial law or emergency declarations, as in the Philippines at the time our classes are meeting, in Malaysia a few years earlier, and also in India a few years hence. Long-term dictatorships, such as in South Korea, North Korea, China, Taiwan, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. Two-faced democracies, where freedom of the press is accepted as a concept, but manipulated to do and be the opposite. Family dynasty rule, the Parks in South Korea, the Kims in North Korea, Chung's in Taiwan, the Macapagals, Marcoses, and Aquinos in the Philippines, the Shinawatra in Thailand, Razaks in Malaysia, Sheikhs in Bangladesh, and Gandhis in India, just for starters. These students, such as Shirley Tan, Thilambo Sivalingam, Abdullah bin Mahmood, and Rajan Moses, need to be aware of a subtle type of press control rearing its head at this time. Under what is called a guided press, mass media are expected to support a national ideology, such as Rukunegara in Malaysia or Pancasila in Indonesia, set up by the authorities to be all-encompassing but vaguely explained, thus keeping journalists off-balanced and prone to take the safe route. What else did I tell my University Science Malaysia students in 1972? Much about developmental journalism, communications. Being in Malaysia, we could not escape the concept of development communication. Kuala Lumpur was a very hub for DevCom. UNESCO, a major spark plug of DevCom, chose Malaysia as a major site for conferences on the subject, and other agencies, such as the National Broadcasting Training Center and the Southeast Asia Press Center, trained media personnel in Malaysia and neighboring countries, hosted national conferences, and published books and a periodical about development journalism. And we at University Science Malaysia had very strong ties with these agencies. Faculty member Vincent Lowe and I made sure the development communication had a prominent place in University Science Malaysia's communication program when we established a curriculum in 1972-73. University Science Malaysia was one of the world's first academic institutions to offer a development communication course, and it was not too long after the pioneering initiatives of the University of the Philippines. Unfortunately, as governments took advantage of development journalism for other purposes, such as a subtle way of regulation, the term took on another meaning in some quarters, and that meaning was government say-so journalism. That first batch of University Science Malaysia students, Chok Chai Sin, Nirmali Devi, Ismail bin Mamat, and Sidi Kotham among them, were coming into the field at a time when new thinking was ripening. Some of the political economy types of thinking. In 1969, the economist Herbert Schiller was able to find an obscure publisher for his book, Mass Communication and American Empire, thus introducing the media imperialism concept, which later became cultural imperialism. E.F. Schumacher was publishing his Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered, about the same time. Actually, it was in press in 1972, coming out in 73. Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed had come out in 1971, and Frantz Fanon's A Dying Colonialism and Wretched of the Earth were in print a few years before that. Whether these books were available to my students is problematic, and if they were on campus, they were probably locked up in the band room banned books room of University Science Malaysia Library, along with a copy of Mahathir's uh, Malay Dilemma. Being enamored by the works of these writers, I imparted this knowledge to students such as Go Gai Cheng, Kaki Lambao, Devi, Molly Matthew, and Mohammed bin Othman in the hopes that they and their fellow classmates would linger a while with the prescription suggested by the catchy title, Economics as if People Mattered, and ponder over sentences like this one from E.F. Schumacher, quote, "Any intelligent fool can make things bigger, more complex, and more violent. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction," unquote. Right after leaving University Science Malaysia in 1974, I fashioned much of my own writing around mass communications in much of the Southern Hemisphere, as I came to understand it while interacting with my students and with professionals in the media in Kuala Lumpur. Topics such as media imperialism, inequities in information flow, press freedom, alternative media, and subjects like that. The high quality of the University Science Malaysia students lent itself well to the practice of Freirean concepts of educating, particularly the two-way learning process between teacher and students that Freire espoused. It is a certainty that in 1972, I dwelt on the pitfalls of the augmented concentration of media ownership into fewer hands, with the likes of such students as Primalani, Ung Chai Lin, Othman bin Haji Rashid, and Harun bin Abdul Karim. By the time of my arrival in Malaysia, I had already written a book on media mogul Samuel I. Newhouse, who financed a communication school at Syracuse University in 1964. The same year I completed my PhD courses, but not my PhD at the same university. No doubt, I told my students that just over 50 companies own 90% of all United States mass media, that just 4 years earlier in 1968, a U.S. newspaper sold for a record unheard price of $50 million. And I'm sure I warned about the dangers of such high ownership concentration by media conglomerates. I told them that it protected vested interests, lessened diversity of opinions, led to political polarization, threatened press freedom and editorial independence, set the public agenda, and ignored the lower strata of society. Can you imagine what I would say today? The situation has become deplorable, with only 6 conglomerates owning 90% of the United States mass media, with conglomerates purchasing other conglomerates, not for millions of dollars, but billions of dollars. In fact, about $100 billion, which is what AT&T shelled out for Warner Media in 2018. The number of subscribers to any one of these 6 corporations is staggering. The world's second largest communication company, Facebook, has 2.8 billion users, about 28% of the inhabitants on Earth. Similarly, media ownership is quickly tightening elsewhere worldwide. A disastrous result of this trend is what critic Herbert Schiller wrote about decades ago. He called it the corporate enclosure of culture, where the media giants have absorbed book publishing, the music industry, the live performance circuit, athletic teams and stadiums, distribution channels, and more. This type of activity has been very disruptive. Another disruption related to mass media unveiled its ugly head about the time Vincent Lowe and I were imploring University Science Malaysia students such as Ibrahim bin Tungu Abdullah, Kamaruzam Tuan, Lee Kim Har, and Kor Soo Kee to report and write the news objectively, accurately, and fairly. Unbeknown to us was that a new journalism was shaping up in the United States and then other parts of the West. This type of journalism defied what we were lecturing about in Penang. Particularly prevalent in broadcasting, it was termed happy talk news, defined by its showcasing handsome and attractive anchors who delivered chatty comments between and during news stories and twisted the news with verbal and nonverbal cues and sensationalized and trivialized content. These shows are topped off with a sexy, provocatively attired weather woman who is there mainly for show. In print journalism, reporters inserted themselves into the news stories, which made for a vastly different type of reporting style, not traditional inverted pyramid, nor investigative, nor interpretive. As this monster grew, informed debates were replaced by incoherent shouting matches. Polarized opinionating became rampant. Broadcasting as a public service dropped out of sight. And eventually, something as ridiculous as the phrase fake news stunk up broadcasting's lexicon. This was more than a disruption. It was destruction. What else did I lecture about those many years ago? Certainly the need to use appropriate and sustainable communication technology in poor, isolated villages, and not to ignore, but to build upon the indigenous traditional communication systems that have worked for centuries. For example, folklore, storytelling, interpersonal communication, the grapevine, and the like. Remember, this is 1972, before the onrush of new information technology of satellites, computers, internet, and so on. That extremely disruptive change was embryoizing as the decade was changing. In the process, shoving aside much of what was acknowledged as beneficial in the development communication era. By the mid-1980s, the marketing of the information age had hit the world full blast. In an article published in 1986, already I criticized the electronic cocoons in which so many people lived. The invasions of privacy and freedom brought about but by computerized telephone, banking, postal, and other databases. The ever-present noise pollution of the never-turned-off television set. The atrophying of the ability to use common sense and the necessary brain power to figure things out without gadgetry, and the myths associated with new information technology. First among these claims is that the technology will lead to a new global village. The claimants of that myth ignored or never knew about the attributes of a true village, such as personal experiences, familiarity, and direct contact. Second, that the new information technology will lead to international understanding and peace. I'm still waiting for that. Third, new information technology will lead to increased independence and promotion of democratic ideals. For that one, think Trump, Duterte, Bolsonaro, Xi, Razak, Kim, Putin, enough said. Fourth, that it will be the salvation of the so-called third world. Perhaps. The jury is still out. But to the governments and transnational conglomerates in control of this technology, serving the masses is not the priority number one. On the contrary, the tendency is to widen the gaps between the haves and have-nots. Okay, returning to 1972 and University Science Malaysia. At that time, I was also encouraging my students to know about mass communication theories and research methodologies, largely conceived in the United States, but totally coming from the Western world. At the same time, I made them aware of the shortcomings of the U.S. conceived research, its dominance by quantitative research built on number crunching with a vague understanding of what was being counted, favoring study of content and message with not much attention paid to the communicator or receiver, and transporting Western-built methodologies to very different cultures of the South without knowing whether they were equivalent functionally, conceptually, linguistically, or metrically. I hope they and others would not shy away from qualitative research, and that they would attempt to develop theories and methods of their own that would be more relevant and worthwhile for countries with very different languages, cultures, religions, and social, economic, and political systems. I challenged the students, requiring that they complete a research paper strengthened by primary sources. Most of them submitted papers that may have been among the first on their chosen subjects, and that rivaled the work of graduate students I supervised later in the United States. Overall, University Science Malaysia students of those first two batches who studied mass communications were the best equipped, best prepared, most intelligent, most honest, and most courteous I had the privilege to engage with in my 51 years in the classroom. Now, back to the theme of this conference. What would I tell students today about media and mass communications in this disruptive era? For a while, I pondered this and pondered what might be expected of me to tell them. For instance, a suitable information aligned with the dominant views and research of the fields. But rather, I would choose to inform them about the dominant power configurations of society and the media, then followed by extensive discussions about the disruptive albeit harmful consequences. It's a new world out there with the same unsolved problems, but elevated to a higher density and intensity. I've already mentioned the escalation of media ownership in pure conglomerates, the worldwide authoritarianism that has moved from a trot to a gallop, and other problems that are still with us in 2021. The internet and its social media capabilities have allowed for faster news reportage, though not without much gossip, rumor, and unsubstantiated reporting. And this results because of lack of needed time given to and needed for establishing the truth, and the untrained individuals presenting the information on social media. If I were in the classroom today, our discussions would revolve around questions and issues that seem to always be present. Who benefits the most from the new information technology? Who pays for it? What are some of the impacts of the thrust of new information technology? I would reiterate what the students more than likely had been told in other classes about its value as a connector of people, its capability to gather, store, and share voluminous amounts of information, its widening of the entertainment spectrum and the range of forms and styles of entertainment, and its efforts to change the flow of information from a one-way to a two-way street. The students and I would revisit questions asked and issues contemplated at the beginning of the information age decades ago. I'm sure we would find that the advantages of communications technology would be still most beneficial to the military to prepare for and engage in warfare, to governments to keep check on, regulate, restrict, and to a lesser extent, facilitate the citizenry, and to the mega corporations to enhance product sales and in the process disemploy and de-skill labor. And the answer to who pays most dearly for this new technology would be the same also. The masses, who are subjected to constant fluctuating prices because of rampant deregulation, who are confused into passivity by bundled fees and other sneaky misnomers, and who are forced to pay huge fees to obtain access to information that formerly had been available free of charge. The social and cultural impacts today, many of those topics come to mind. Enough to fill entire university courses. The inundation of society with an information overload. The augmented electronic cocoonification of lifestyles. The gnarling nuisances of constant surveillance and invasions of privacies. The replacement of real experience with virtuality. The more frequent use of Orwellian newspeak. The drying up of free enterprise in the media industries at the hands of conglomerates. The crippling impacts of addiction to social media, cell phones, video games, and television formats, and the seeking of fake pleasures from the media. Let me tell you about a phenomenon in South Korea that exemplifies fake pleasures derived from a broadcasting format. It's called sampo. Sampo means three, po means giving up. So it means giving up three things. and it relates to the hopelessness felt by the younger generation, willing to give up relationships, marriage, and children, and to get their pleasures virtually by watching television shows of fake marriages, fake romance, and substituting a food show for a dining partner. I do not favor ending this talk without coming up with possible solutions to, or at least suggestions for, resolving some of the issues brought up. The world has had communication disruptive eras before, perhaps of an even larger magnitude, such as capturing images, light, and sound that uprooted the 19th century. What makes this era vastly different and difficult to remedy is the concentration of ownership and control in a handful of corporations. It has been my honor to reminisce with you and about those 2 years in the early 1970s that I had the pleasure to teach and learn from the finest undergraduate students I have encountered, and to rehash mass communication concerns that I've had for that time and longer. I thank you heartily for including me in this celebratory event, and I wish the University of Science Malaysia School of Communications much continued success. Terima kasih. Thank you.